IVM.
Artificial intelligence, what is that? It sure sounds like science fiction, but it's very much a part of our world today. But most of us lack understanding and a means to use AI to our advantage. Luckily, though, Intel's Digital Readiness Program empowers everyone with skill sets, mindsets, and tool sets to use in an AI-fueled world, so you don't end up like me. The Intel AI for Youth program is an initiative that guides today's youth to an understanding of AI, how it is designed, and why it's important today. Intel's been working with the CBSE, Ministry of Education, and the Government of India to empower today's youth to build social impact solutions while demystifying what AI is. How do you take advantage of this? Purchase an Intel Core-powered PC and you get free access to 80+ hours of immersive and hands-on training about AI. On completion of the program, along with a certificate, you get access to AI toolsets to try put what you learn to good use. Log on to futurebanaowonderful.intel.com. Future Banao Wonderful by bringing home an Intel-powered PC.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I joined Goa, as if you who have been following All Things Policy for a while might know. And one of my favorite things about the Goa Archaeological Museum is this very interesting statue of a god called Vetala, who is usually described as a skeletal figure with protruding fangs and a lolling tongue coming out of his mouth, who is usually absolutely stark naked and, not to put too fine a point on it, a giant raging erection. And the worship of Vetala actually continues to this very day in parts of rural Goa. He's considered to be a kind of protector deity who comes and visits villages. And there are similar deities to Vetala across India's west coast, quite interestingly. If you look at the Tulu countries, for example, in coastal Karnataka, there is a worship of these deities called bhutas, who can also be described as, for example, ghouls. Generally have these very interesting kind of quote-unquote subaltern kind of backgrounds. There are, for example, Muslim bhutas such as Ali Bhuta. And it's not really something that's restricted to Tulu Nadu and Goa either, because we also have versions of this kind of worship in Kerala as well. I have with me my friend Aditya Mohanan. Aditya is one of the most interesting guys I know. He's an archaeologist and a musician. He has this fascinating metal album called Of the Lotus and the Thunderbolt. That's a freaking epic name. We'll put a Spotify link in the description if you guys are interested. And not only is Aditya a fairly successful musician, but he's also a successful archaeologist and art historian. He has recently published a very interesting paper in the SOAS Journal of Postgraduate Studies about the worship of these interesting deities called Theyyams in Kerala. And what we're going to be doing over the next half an hour or so is trying to understand the rituals that are involved in the worship of these fascinating deities. How exactly did the worship of them originate? Who are the communities that are involved in their worship? And how are perceptions of Theyyams and their worship different from what we call the quote-unquote great tradition? If you've listened to my previous podcast on All Things Policy with Vivek Joseph, then you might know a little bit about them. We've been talking about local traditions and how they're perceived in comparison to, say, temple-based Puranic traditions for quite a while over the last few months. But without any further ado, let's actually come and try to understand the worship of Theyyams. Aditya, tell us about it. What exactly are Theyyams and what is the worship of Theyyams in Kerala like?
Hi, Anirudh. Thanks for having me on here. It's nice to be on here again. So, Theyyam is actually one of the most fascinating subjects I've ever come across because even though I grew up in Bombay, I would go back to my hometown of Payanur, which is extremely north in the Malabar region of Kerala. And I think every October to uh, February time scale, every year that I was there, my family would take me to see this ritual, which was essentially what today many would call a possession ritual. Now, I think there's a lot of nuance that goes into quote unquote a possession ritual in every geocultural landscape. But with the image, really interesting. You have these usually men, I would like to stress on men, dressing up or donning the garb of local deities, which most likely no one's heard of who's not from the region, unless it's a researcher or someone who's particularly interested in Tayyam. And there's like a ritual that spans roughly 3 days to like a week of a time scale. And it's a very interesting one. You have 3 days of the god slowly descending into the body of the performer. And there's a bunch of rituals that the performer is expected to undertake before the god finally is sort of embodies the man in that situation. And then what you see is some of the most like exciting moments of my life, like, visually speaking, because just to paint a rough picture, you have at the final stage of the ritual, you have a man who's dressed in like this almost otherworldly looking sacred attire. It's just a mixture of whites, blacks, and yellows and reds and silver, and there's a lot of weapons that are sort of jangling, and a lot of bells and a lot of drums, and like creating this hypnotic rhythm, and you have this man dancing to the rhythm of these drummers, and if the drummers adapting to the movements of the dancer. And at the end of it, and there's of course a large crowd. This is happening as a spectacle, but this is not just a random spectacle on the road. This is a very, very curated space that has to do a lot with the idea of sacred and profane. And you towards the end of the ritual, you have devotees coming in to ask the deity for various things, like that just, I guess, human beings have desires. And they consider these deities very powerful because it's a very direct opportunity to talk to a divine creature. And, I think it's one of the most fascinating things, one of the most fascinating rituals that I think survive in India. And I think it's got a very, very interesting, rich history, but I think a lot of it is really muddy because this is one of those rituals that are not documented because this doesn't happen in a temple. There's always a difference. If you go to, for example, if you go to Payyanur, which is my hometown, you'll see that there's a local Subramania temple that is dedicated. He's sort of like a high god, like, the worship is predominantly facilitated by Nambudhiris, who are Brahmins of the regions. But when you go for a Theyyam worship, what you see is there's local centers of worship, and they're a lot more modest than a temple, a lot less ornamental, and just like smaller space wise, and it's predominantly people from depressed classes of society that facilitate the worship of Tayyam. So there's a few stark differences, but it's also very interesting how people they don't differentiate between where the god comes from. And when you worship god, there's only one god. At least that's what I've seen as a perceiver of the ritual.
This is very interesting because there seems to be this tendency, not just in coastal southern India, but more generally across southern India as well. And if you look at, for example, in Telangana, or if you look at the worship of INR in Tamil Nadu, which incidentally I did a podcast on with Julie Wayne for those who've been following all things policy for a while. But that again, like, kind of has a lot of similar elements in the sense that this is belief that individuals from a particular community, and very often not from an upper caste community, are possessed by a deity and become a sign of the deity. And people generally from across class and caste backgrounds believe in and believe that this deity has come into the body of this particular individual and kind of worship him or her and then interact with them, ask them for protection, ask them for blessings, ask them for prophecies somehow. And it's also interesting to think about just how ancient a lot of these religious ideas might be, right? We know, for example, in the case of Mailur or Malanna in the Deccan, that he's a very syncretic deity who kind of whose worship incorporates the practices of Hindu communities, or I say quote unquote Hindu communities who come from pastoralist backgrounds as well as Muslims. But what about Thayyams, Aditya? Like, how did the worship of Thayyams originate? Who exactly are the communities that that embody this practice, that continue the worship of Thayyams to this day? And how exactly do you think the practice of Thayyam itself kind of reflects the historical trajectory that these communities have been through?
Right. It's very interesting that you brought up that possession rituals happen all across the South. And I think that's a very interesting, that was for me in my study, that was my starting point of asking questions. Of course, answers are very difficult to find, so I can't give you an absolute answer. But I think what the evidence points to is that um, local communities in all across South India, and I think particularly I would say like the coastal region, like, for example, you mentioned Tulunad. Tulunad has a ritual called Bhuta Kola, which is, as you said earlier, rituals that have to do with Bhutas. Bhutas, particularly the way Bhutas are interpreted from my ethnography in the field, what I've understood is Bhuta sort of contrasts a Deva in a sense that a Deva is omniscient, omnipresent. You can appeal to a deva from anywhere, anytime. Bhuta is sort of an elemental deity. And now, when we say that, it can take multiple garbs. It can either be like a forest deity, or like the deity of a river or a pond or something, or it can also be a ancestor, sort of like a ghost. I hate to use the word ghost, but like for the sake of brevity, I will have to use that word. Um, Now, when we see like Bhuta Kola, when we see Theyyam, there's a lot of similarities. When you watch the rituals, there's a lot of similarities. If you're interested, Wikipedia does a very good job of describing Bhuta Kola actually. And then you go down south further in Kerala and you see Bhadrakali rituals happening in the same way, where you have um, the entire, there's this entire Puranic episode that is sort of, and this is, but again, is very different from Theyyam when you look at the caste dynamics and when you look at the narratives that are being portrayed over there. But nevertheless, let's just say the cosmetic form of it is strikingly similar. You have a man who dresses up as Bhadrakali and sort of enacts, like different communities enact different stages of the story of Bhadrakali killing Darika, the demon, the Asura, whatever you want to call it. And then I think when you go further inwards in Kerala towards Pathanamthitta, you have another ritual called Padayani. My friend Rohit actually is also a performer of Padayani, one of the communities that ends up performing Padayani.
Oh
And
wow.
they also have their own sort of this possession thingy going on, where a bunch of communities involved, there's a bunch of music that happens, and it's sort of a reenaction of a ritual, right? So now the thing is, when we look at the teleology of every ritual as that happens as such, these possession rituals, it seems that at different in different geocultural spaces they serve different purposes. I feel like Tayyam and Bhutakola, yeah, maybe the functions are kind of similar, but if you take Padayani and Tayyam, which both happen in Kerala, the functions and the functionings also are extremely different. But at the same time, when we look at the cosmetics of it, I think it becomes a little bit apparent to the viewer that, somewhere these rituals could have, very likely, could have had a common origin. Not necessarily, and that's a different debate. But just when we look at the cosmetics of it and we look at the way the ritual is ordered and the different stages of the ritual, I feel like there could be a similar origin, which is what a lot of researchers have postulated as well. Now
That's a
the
very
thing is,
interesting point, Aditya. I just want to like leap in here to kind of highlight the fact that you're talking about this cosmetic aspect of it, and you're talking about the fact that it works differently in different kinds of geocultural spaces, right? The kind of meanings that it has for local communities
yeah,
can vary quite significantly, and I think
absolutely,
that's such an interesting point because it kind of shows that community might be picking up from the same kind of set of ritual practices and continues to reformulate them to suit its own objectives and its own kind of religious or spiritual or political or social needs over the centuries, which I find so fascinating when we're looking at local rituals like this, is that there isn't like a single hard and fast rule that explains how they operate. You have to actually do an ethnographic study like what you've done to understand the way
absolutely.
that local communities formulate and engage with these practices.
Yeah, I'd say the key word here is function. What function does this serve? Like, I mean, I probably would risk upsetting some believers in this case, but hey, I am also a believer, just I believe in it differently. But getting back to, I think, the origin of this, I feel like the common origin at some point, if you, I don't want to convolute the argument by like, debating about cultural historical narratives over here, but I feel like if a set of communities were sort of how do I say this? They all had their own version of this sort of a ritual, which even today is the case, as you said, in Goa as well, like which is western coast of India. You have this sort of a possession ritual happening with Vetal, and then your Buddha worship. So what the picture that's drawn over here is that there's rituals based on a similar skeletal structure. The apparatus is sort of somewhere picking up from a similar, how do I say this, similar set of attributes of like ritual attributes, and they're using it differently at different points in space and time to suit different purposes. So
So, Aditya, so like, what exactly was this kind of social context from which these practices were picked up to create the Theyyam art form? What do you think?
Right. So from I can only speak about the Tayyam as much as I would love to speak about every ritual. I don't think I'm qualified to do that. But I think it's like when we look at that particular region, we do look at the history and the processes, the cultural processes, and we do look at the sociology of the region to understand why Tayyam looks the way it did today. Which like I'm so sure Tayyam just 200, 300 years ago must have looked so different, must have probably served a different purpose, you know. So
Right.
everything that a ritual demonstrates, I think, somewhere also is a reaction to the social tone, the tone of society at that point. I don't like that word tone, which it's very vague. But let's just say the condition of society in that moment, the social condition depends on where you are in society, you know, and the communities that um, conduct the Tayyam rituals predominantly are communities from depressed classes. So historically, we would see them as people from mainly from the untouchable communities, and the caste system in Kerala is extremely rigorous at that point in history. As anyone who studied the history of Kerala would know. For example, a very popular quote would be Swami Vivekanand's. Um, but in my opinion, I feel like Tayyam has like mainly to do with the social positioning of the people who conduct these rituals. Because for the most part, when we see the rituals that are being conducted and the gods that are being venerated and the deities that are possessing the performers, these are usually people. If you consider their mythologies, you will see that they were wronged at some point. And there's a social injustice as a motive is very, very, very pronounced in that
Hmm.
sense. So I think for me, I think it's better to talk about a personal experience. So I was observing this Tayyam known as Kandanar Kelan, in which happens all around Payyanur, Nileshwar sort of area, and the mythology. This is what I understood from speaking to three different communities that perform the same Tayyam. Um, and mind you, there's over 400 different tayyams, so like everyone
Wow.
must be considered equally, like yeah, it's really vast. But so when I was speaking to families that conduct the Kandanar Kelan tayyam ritual, the mythology is like sort of painful. It's, you know, as contrasted to, let's just say, sort of like a high god narrative. If you take, Ram winning the battle against Ravan, or Krishna rescuing people from different cases, or like sort of mentoring Arjuna, or like it's very different from a hero. It's actually the protagonist in this case is someone who suffered social injustice because of his, her, or their position in society. It's not that there's anyone directly coming and affecting the well-being of the people that are being portrayed here. It's more so that their social positioning and conditioning is getting them into landing them in situations that are extremely, extremely, just let's just like horrible, you know. So Kandanar Killen is a really sad story. There's this man who is from a depressed class. The caste that mainly perform Kandanar Killen are the Vannan caste. Historically, they're the washerman caste, and washermen not of like upper caste clothes, or they're washermen of lower caste people's clothing, and so clothing that would be seen as impure traditionally, like for example blood soaked clothes, or like sort of like clothes that were used during sort of like a birth giving ceremony of sorts, so like that's what the Vanan caste professional had to like entail. That was the profile. So this is predominantly performed by the caste that does this. Now you have the ritual, which also, like, of course, someone doesn't do just one thing. There's many like occupations that you can seek out, no matter which position of society you're in. I mean, if we look at it realistically. So the man who we're concerned with in this mythology, his story entails that he sort of found himself this job, this gig, where he had to pick up dried leaves that were fallen all over the estate where he was working, and he had to collect them, pull them on. And I think every fortnight he had to set fire to them and basically make sure that it's a presentable estate, you know. And one of these days, where he was setting fire to these massive heaps of dried twigs and leaves and whatnot, he found himself stuck in the midst of the fire. And there was no escape. He could not find any way out. So he attempted to climb a tree, which was in the center of wherever this activity is going on. And as he climbed the tree, he saw that there's two to three cobras that are seated on the branches, just perched, just looking at him. He immediately jumps off the branch, as anyone would do. I mean, I would do that. And he is the cobras jump off as well. This is again, this is a story. Let's not take this too literally. And basically, the story ends with him dying in the flames, being chased by cobras and being bitten by them. Now, again, I don't want to emphasize. I don't want to. It's not. It's. I don't think it's relevant whether this story is true or not. It's rather the emotion, the sentiment behind the story that is extremely important, is what I would say. Because that sentiment is a reflection of the collective sentiment of the community that conducts these rituals, And the theme, injustice and tragedy, I would say these are the two keywords I would use to sort of, summarize the the emotional spectrum of the story. And even today, if you see Kandanar Killan, it's like there's on his torso, you see two snakes coming in from the left and right side of his lower abdomen section, and sort of their mouths sort of center around his left and right nipples. And that, I think it's also like being played into the symbol over there. So when a witch, someone who's perceiving the ritual is looking at the Theyyam, they also see the snake symbolism, and they see that, like at a very sensitive point in that human being's body is where the snake is sort of the fangs are being, you know what I'm talking about, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, I think like that's a very interesting one. And another one is definitely would like women, women Thayyams, who incidentally are played by men, which is another whole topic. But would be that there's, which is again, to cut it down short, is a story that has to do with injustice. And there's this woman who's from in this case, she's from an upper caste family, even though she is venerated by lower castes. In the mythology, she's from an upper caste family. And the story doesn't involve a caste atrocity, it involves a gender atrocity in this case. And you have this woman who's actually very young, and who's not, she's, according to the story, she's completely innocent, and she has no reason to entertain people who are slandering her. But nevertheless, her family ends up sort of asking her to vindicate her own reputation in that sense. And then you have Shiva and Parvati coming into the story, and this it's revealed to her that she's a Devi, and when she was supposed to immolate herself, the fire does not burn her in that sense. And out comes the Devi. There's a metamorphosis, and the woman who was being wronged in that circumstance ends up becoming a deity who has to be worshipped and satisfied. And at least that's the moral of that story. So you have roughly about over 400 stories like this. Like, of course, there are some Thayyams that have today taken on the garb of, there's for example Vishnumurti Thayyam, who is a very ferocious looking Thayyam. And if you look at the ritual, there's some sacrificial elements involved, just to get the gist of it. But nevertheless, it's said to be a very benevolent Tayyam, and the narrative is very different from the ones that we are speaking of over here. It's sort of more like a Sanskritic narrative, to say. I hope that clears out that point.
This is fascinating. Like, there's just a sheer variety of stories and like different historical kernels. Like, I mean, as you said, it doesn't necessarily matter if these are based on real events or not. But the fact that these stories have taken shape the way that they have reveals a lot about the practitioners of this art form and the social circumstances that their ancestors initially lived in that led to their stories evolving in this particular way, which is so fascinating. The fact that you have upper caste individuals who are believed to have become Thayyams, the fact that this woman especially I find very interesting, because even though she is supposed to have been, an injustice was committed to her by men, she continues to have her story performed by male performers. So what I find really interesting what you approach, Aditya, is that there's this intersectional aspect to it, where you're looking at oligarchies not just of caste and class, but also of a gender as well. That even though Theyyam is an art form that is performed by historically depressed communities such as Dalits, that nevertheless there are still dynamics even within the performance of the Theyyam art form, which is just so interesting to think about. Okay, so all of this is really fascinating, Aditya. But one thing that I particularly enjoy, that in addition to the research you've done on Theyyams in general, is this kind of ethnomusicological approach that you've got going in the paper,
Yeah.
where you kind of look at how different ethnographies have responded to what is fundamentally the same kind of idea of kind of propitiating deities using music. So can you tell us a little bit about the way that like modern perceptions of, say, let's say temple drummers differ with relation to that of Theyyam drummers? Like, is there a caste angle to this? Is there a religious angle to this? What have you seen in your explorations on the ground?
I would say there's definitely a caste angle to this. Religious angle, too. I mean, I think a lot of most Tayyam performers, I think, situate themselves within what you would today call the Hindu religion. But the caste one is not so pronounced as such, because like casteism works very differently today than it worked just say like 70, 80 years ago in Kerala. So it's sort of there's undercurrents. There's never like an overt form of discrimination or such. It's more like there's a sense of perception that is definitely shaped by, I mean, I would say the caste and also the role that the chanda players play in a Melam setting versus a Tayyam setting.
Hmm.
So if when you take the Melam, it's a lot more structured. It's a lot more organized, and I mean, you can tell that there's a syllabus that has been put in place to impart knowledge to children who start training in Melam performances for like the chenda drummers for like or even tagil or any form of percussion rather and they train alongside someone who's playing the melodic element of the ritual. So when
Hmm.
we say there's different talas, different ragas that are supposed to be employed at particular points in the day, at particular spots within the temple compound. Particular sounds can only be played at certain points in space and time. And at the same time, the kind of education that they received is extremely, as I said, there's a whole corpus that has been, it's a very systemic way of imparting knowledge onto someone. So therefore,
Hmm.
like the way they go about it's a ritual form of music essentially. So at different points in the ritual there's different elements of music, so that basically means that all these musicological elements also are situated within a ritual paradigm, and this is in turn supplemented with these people are often also taught Sanskritic mythology and Puranic narratives and shlokas and stuff like that.
Hmm.
This as contrasted with in my study when I was interviewing the chanda players from like a Theyyam setting is very very different. The way they learn how to play the chanda, even though if you see the techniques and the counts and the aesthetics and as well as the make of the instrument and the sourcing of the ecological materials that are required to build these instruments is
Hmm.
actually remarkably similar, remarkably, which is
Interesting.
what yes, which is what leads me and other researchers to believe that this instrument has been in the region way longer than other like later cultural um, how do I say this? Like, for example, I would say this is definitely a pre-Brahminical instrument in the region, and not just in
Hmm.
Kerala. They're all over. I'm sure in the Deccan also there are instances that you could point out to, and even in Tamil Nadu, there's a variant of the chanda. So, when we come to Theyyam performance, the usage is very very different. They are not seen as musicians by themselves, and the main reason for that is because not a rehearsed sort of a activity in that sense. It's sort of it's there's templates, there's performance templates where like at certain points when you watch Kandanar Kelan, there's an introduction where he comes and addresses the crowd, and then there's this sort of a blood curdling kind of a war cry,
Hmm.
and then slowly you start building the flame up, and as the flame increases in size, the speed of the performer also increases because you can't spend as much time in a greater flame as compared to like smaller flame. So there's all these rough sketches around which but whatever happens between point A and B is where the improvisation and artistic element would also come in a certain sense. So what often happens is the drummers, they don't have a set structure. They're usually complementing or they're drawing from the movements and the gestures that the Theyyam dancer, the dancer who's engaging in the Kaliyatam himself, it's sort of like a give and take that is happening over there. So even though in my sense, in my idea, I would definitely call that musical. But for a lot of people, music means a very different thing, so that really, it really boils down to semantics over there. But you do see why, when we say in a Merlin, when we say there's a composition, the composition and the way it goes, and if you've heard this since you were a child, you can probably hum the tunes, and for example, when there's a particular drum roll, you're just like, oh yeah, there's going to be a transition now, because that's what the drum roll stands for. But in
Hmm.
the case of Tayyam, there's no predictability as such. It's complementing the motion of the dancer at the same time, and the dancer is drawing from the rhythm and the tempo of the chenda players in that circumstance. So you see why it's not understood particularly as music, which also means that they don't get the kind of a distinguished recognition that I believe they do deserve.
There's a lot to think about there, but let's just come back to it after a quick ad break.
Security on a computer is like a layered cake. No matter how secure each layer may be, attackers and hackers will work tirelessly to find a vulnerability and exploit it. These cyber attacks can sneak into a system unnoticed, eventually gaining access to all the programs and files on your computer stack. Luckily, with Intel vPro platform, all of this is avoidable. Intel vPro has the Intel Hardware Shield, which adds protection to every layer of the computer system with 3 groups of security capabilities. Advanced Threat Protection, which helps quickly detect and remediate the latest ransomware and crypto mining attacks on the system. Below the OS Security, which helps identify unauthorized changes to hardware and firmware. And Application and Data Protection, which helps prevent memory corruption and malware injection. So secure your organization's productivity with hardware-based security only with Intel vPro. Visit intel.in/IT heroes to know more. Intel vPro, built for business.
Okay, yeah. So we were saying the recognition angle is very interesting. I'd like to dwell on that a little bit because I did this very interesting discussion with this filmmaker called Julie Wayne, who studies the worship of INR in rural Tamil Nadu. And basically, the worship of INR is mostly based on the activities of this particular caste of potters called the Whalers. And these guys have been making pottery for the god for generations. They spend a good chunk of their year just creating these beautiful terracotta offerings, shaped as cattle or as horses, which are then given to the god. But
Yeah, I'm
increasingly,
familiar.
yeah, right. So but increasingly whalers today, the potters are refusing to teach their children their craft, and they're refusing to let the children even come near their clay. They want them to get a modern education and seek modern, high-paying jobs because it's simply not economical to be full-time potters anymore. The way that India is modernized and globalized. And I'm wondering, given that there's this kind of gap in the perception between how temple musicians versus Theyyam musicians are kind of perceived publicly, does it also result in a difference in the way that they are treated by the state in terms of the kind of financial support they receive?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I've spoken about this towards the ending, the conclusion of my paper. This is almost exactly what you described that's happening with the Velar potters of Ayyanar in Tamil Nadu is actually what's happening. It's pretty much the same thing. So with Merlin performers, there's the Devaswam board takes care of them. They get a certain amount of stipend every month for their service to preserving this heritage. You can learn more if you read the paper. I don't want to get too much into which benefits goes to whom and what, but there's problems
Sure.
with that, which is a totally different debate altogether. But at the same time, they're at least getting some amount, even though it's not enough to by today's standards. These were laws that were made in the 80s, so the economy is drastically changed now. That amount does not suffice anymore to keep and this is particularly happening in the Marar caste. the temple drummers, they're from this caste called the Marar caste. So it's really not keeping the generations today. It's not keeping them hooked on to like, oh yeah, I want to preserve this tradition. But at the same time, there's some incentive. There is some incentive. So you definitely have more younger generation Mara drummers joining temple ensembles and melams and stuff. Whereas when you see Theyyam performers, from my experience, from my interviews, what I understood was that there's a overwhelmingly large amount of Velan Vanan drummers who just are not very interested to teach their children how to play this. They would rather send them and get them in like an engineering degree or medicine degree, or like a job that is does basically lets them go above and beyond a hand to mouth existence. So the tradition is definitely being compromised in that sense. And the thing with Theyyam is a little complicated. The Kerala government offers benefits to artists, but the thing with Theyyam is it's somewhere liminal. Like we're not too sure if it's a ritual or an art form, and I think that also means that they're excluded from receiving the kind of benefits that they should be receiving, particularly for I think some Theyyam performers do are ensuring that they do receive some benefits from the state, because they've started sort of coalescing together and coming together, understanding that yeah, there is a collective need for some sort of remuneration for keeping this tradition alive. But at the same time, it's they all treated as Theyyam performers. It doesn't matter which duty you are assigned, or which sort of pillar of the ritual you are serving as. It's everyone's seen as just a Theyyam performer. So there's no sense of distinction. Whereas if you see the way the temple authorities get their benefits, there is a stratified understanding of the every individual plays a different role in the structure, so the benefits also have to be a reflection of the role that they play. That is not there in the case with the Theyyam performers. So that is what I've noticed.
Fascinating. As always, Aditya, like you've given us this a really fascinating and nuanced perspective of how India's vibrant local traditions are kind of clashing with the way that India is modernizing, and what happens to heritage at the intersection of these two massive cogs, as it were. The paper was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to make sure there's a link in the description, and also a link to your album, The Lotus and the Thunderbolt, for all the metal aficionados in our listenership. So thank you as always, man. It's been a real pleasure having you, and we'll hope to see you on All Things Policy soon. Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hey everybody, it's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On the Wire Talk, Siddharth is joined by Nikhil Anand, an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania and an environmental anthropologist. They discuss his plan and proposals with the BMC to fight the effects of climate change that we are already seeing in Mumbai. In the podcast special on Storytellers and Storytellers, Vineet talks to the hosts of New Kids on the Block, Anya, Kavya, and Tere, about what it's like to be Indian teenage podcasters. In the season 3 finale of Echoes of India, Anirudh explores South Asia at the time of its most famous ancient figure, Ashoka Maurya. On All Things Policy, Suyash and Aditya analyze the constant changes of China's generals in their liberation army and what it means for India. And on Smarter with Sid, learn from Siddharth how listening can help you make a better presentation. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. It really does help us. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quota, CoinSwitch, Kuber, and Inter vPro. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Remember the days when our granny used to narrate once upon a time stories? Let's bring back the good old days of moral stories with Storytime Tamil. Hi, I am Ravishankar Balachandran, host of Storytime Tamil podcast. I would like you to entertain and educate your children with stories from Storytime Tamil. tune in to the new episode sharp at 7 p.m. every day on IVM website, IVM podcast app, YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcast from.